Welcome, everyone, to Headlines and History with me, your host, John Mollick. Thank you for joining me this week as we have another interview on deck with Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Bennett. Colonel Bennett is with the New York Army National Guard. We happen to have served together for a number of years. We did deploy together in 2012, but most recently she spent the last 3 years in Europe supporting U.S. Army European Command in her intelligence role, first as an intelligence planner, and then as an analysis and control element chief for the latter portion of her time there. She joins me today for a discussion specifically focused on her time in Europe. We talk a little bit about her career as a whole, but we really focus on what her job was while she was there, particularly dealing with the Russian threat and supporting our NATO partners as they support Ukraine in the defense against the Russian invasion. It was a really, really great discussion with Colonel Bennett. So let me add the weekly caveat. Neither of us speak for the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government in any way. And although we both remain in the business, all of our opinions are our own, particularly in this event for her, because I will be asking most of the questions and she'll be doing most of the talking. But again, neither of us speak for the government in this capacity. So now that we have that out of the way, sit back, relax, and enjoy a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Bennett. Thanks for joining me, ma'am. I appreciate it. We did the details of who you are and what we're doing here today in the intro, so we're going to jump right into it. So let's start at the very beginning. Why did you decide to join the military?
It was a combination of my early upbringing was kind of strained or not ideal, I would say, and so I kind of wanted to get out of the environment, but also like the most competent adults around me had a military background. And then when I was 10, my dad got employment in Saudi Arabia. So I saw at a very young age, how different societies are. And Saudi had a lot of interesting societal controls, especially for Westerners at the time, restrictions on religion and, things you could bring in the country. Like I had a VHS tip of ET and the customs agent told me that it was evil. And so that really left an impression on me on, okay, how America is different and why that's worth defending. And then in high school, I moved to Germany. And Germany was great. Like I didn't see those kind of societal controls, but my family situation deteriorated even more. And the stability that was provided to me by adults came from military adults. So it just seemed like a safe place to go, to be able to go to college. That was a goal. It was really important to me. So that's how I kind of ended up in the Army.
So where did you live in Saudi Arabia when you were there?
I lived in Riyadh. And it's very interesting. My dad was there when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So Scud missiles fell like a mile from the compound that we lived in. And we were in vacation for the summer in the States, but my mom was like, we're not going back there. And so, having had my dad at risk, having people that I know and cared about at risk was really kind of important. And then, when Desert Storm happened, I kind of watched that enraptured on TV, and it just cemented further that it's like, okay, the military is the place to be.
That's fascinating because a lot of people would go through that experience, or you'd think they'd go through that experience and say the military is not where I want to be because of issues like that. But we're lucky to have people like yourself who look at that scenario and say, no, that's where I need to be. How long were you there?
We lived in Saudi for a year and a half. So my father lived there for 3.5 years. We came a little bit after he'd been there. So it was enough because of the way the passport or the visa restrictions were. My mom and I had to go back a couple of times. So we went through customs a lot where we experienced, restricting behaviors.
Okay. So you decided to join the Army. You did. So how did that work out? When is it that you got in, and kind of give us a little breakdown of what that career was like up to and what you're doing now?
I enlisted in the late 1900s in 1998 as a young MI soldier. And then I was able to earn a green to gold scholarship and go and complete college, which, I had said was important to me. And then I've had just a very typical key development track for, your MI tactical officer. I was a battalion S2 and an air cav squadron S2 in Iraq. I was MI company commander, as you know, because we did that together. We started out working for an IBCT, but then later on we went and worked for a combined joint interagency task force. And then I was Sustainment Brigade S2, from another great unit in New York, the 369th Harlem Hellfighters. That unit did theater distribution of sustainment commodities to all of the Central Command AOR, so all of the Middle East. So we supported all of the big missions, Operation Spartan Shield, Inherent Resolve, and Freedom Sentinel. And then I was Deputy G2 for the 42nd Infantry Division. As you also know, we did a lot of good work there getting prepared for the division to go to OSS. And then I departed the division before that deployment and went on to be an intel planner and the analysis control chief at an Army Service Component Command.
That's a lot. That's a lot for a National Guard officer. That's a resume that sounds more like an active duty officer, but I think it just demonstrates your willingness to challenge yourself, and as well as combination of that, and then how busy, if you will, the National Guard has been since post 9/11. You and I both can speak to it directly to say that the National Guard of today is not the National Guard of the 80s and 90s. That's for sure. And we have officers like yourself who are involved in so many real world deployments and real world missions downrange that, there's just a closer connection between those in the National Guard and those in active duty for sure. What would be, you would say, your favorite position you held throughout your military career? When I say favorite, I mean not so much the most influential or the one where you made the biggest effect or had the biggest effect, say, on the battle space, but just the one where you had the most fun and you enjoyed it the most, if you will.
I have a feeling you're not going to like my answer. I can't choose one. Like in every chapter I got to work, I was so lucky to work with like talented people, brilliant people dedicated to these complex problems. I mean, you and I lived that experience, right? Where like, okay, we have this complex problem. How are we attacking it? And I got to learn from great soldiers and NCOs, warrant officers like you, and our DA civilians, and contractors. So I know it sounds like maybe it sounds like an easy way out, but like I remember something poignant about every single one of those experiences. And I was just super lucky to have great teammates. And these problem sets we worked on, are becoming or have become part of history in some cases. I mean, that's when you looked at a life well lived or a life well examined, I mean, that's huge to know great people and to have contributed to history, hopefully in a positive way. At least I hope history looks at what we did in a positive way, right?
Yeah, agreed. And no, I won't consider it a cop out because I have a similar story. I don't think I could actually ever pick one position I ever held. I could certainly articulate one of the positions I held about why it was the worst I ever held, but I don't know if I could come up with my favorite. But so you touched briefly on your most recent career position, and let me say full-time career position, and that was when you spent some time in Europe, and you just came back from there a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago. I mean, you'll remind me, but so what was it like there? How did you find yourself over in Europe doing work for EUCOM, and how did it go?
So I had always kind of wanted to be an intel planner. I think that you have known me long enough to know I have this really weird passion for operational art and military decision-making process and operations orders. I probably need to see a behavioral health, treatment provider because I don't think it's normal. But so having taken a hand at that at our division experience, using CONOPs and OPORD process to kind of organize the G2, I'd kind of like wondered, could I do it on a larger scale? Could I optimize the intelligence warfighter function in a larger kind of stage? And so I saw the position. I applied. For those of you in the National Guard Reserves, I applied through Tour of Duty. They have a new website that now you can access without being on an Army domain called Carrera. And so they had the vacancy, and I think I actually got an email from NGB that it was a vacancy open and went to Tour Duty to apply. So I spent 2.5 years as an intelligence planner at the Army Service Component Command. So that's U.S. Army Forces Europe and Africa. When I got there, it was just U.S. Army Forces Europe, and then we had to actually plan how we were going to absorb the Africa part, which is complicated, and I won't get into it on this podcast. But so we're the Army Component Command for the Combatant Commander, which is EUCOM, European Command. And then we're also the Army Forces Commander for the theater. So we had a very busy time as a planner, but it allowed me to get to know things about NATO, to get to understand the alliance, to get to understand the theater and all the kind of nuances of bringing intelligence soldiers into the theater. And then, I worked really hard in that position, and a group, actually a pair of warrant officers came to me and they said, "Hey, would you want to interview for this analysis component element chief?" And for people who are not intelligence, it's a very well-known position in the intel community. I don't think infantry guys know what it means, though. But the analysis, the ACE is what it's called, is kind of the hub for all of the intel analysis. So we would get and integrate assessments from our subordinate commands, like the Sustainment Command and the Missile Defense Command, and our infantry corps. And then also we had our own all-source effort integrating a lot of multi-intelligence discipline information as it came in, and then providing those predictive assessments for the commander, to help them make decisions, hopefully good decisions in enough space and time, to make a positive difference. So it was kind of crazy that they asked me, because I'm a National Guardsman, and it's funny, there's a lot of ADOS positions in USAREF. Their headquarters is expanding, kind of based off what happened in Russia, but some of it was planned anyway. So it's a great place to learn and grow if you're trying to do something challenging. But for them to come to a National Guard officer, so I interviewed against active duty officers and was chosen. And I was like, "You sure you want me? Are you sure?" And they were like, "Yes." So it was a huge, I felt very humbled every day to go into work with very talented and brilliant people who really had a knack for looking at problems and breaking them down.
That's awesome. What in the realm of what you can talk about, help us understand what it is that you were doing. I understand what you were doing from an intelligence framework, and I know what your intelligence responsibilities were, but what is it that your job was doing at that time? What was the focus? Why do all of that intelligence work while you were there?
We always looked at kind of, protecting soldiers in Europe from threats. And I think, it's a lot like kind of when you look at Kuwait, right? We're like, okay, the immediate threat in Kuwait is traffic accidents, right? So what are we looking at in what you would call Western Europe, for where we have all these soldiers? And USAR was postured, especially with NATO, really at the beginning of 2020, to start doing a lot of combined exercises. Anything from like platoon level fires exercises to we did command post exercises with our NATO partners. And people read about in the news the Defender series of exercises. It had, active live components where people were doing joint forcible entry training, with the 82nd, other countries were doing that. And then we at the command post level were integrating with multinational corps Northeast and some of our other NATO partners, to figure out, okay, how would we mission command a multi-corps fight in large-scale combat operations, and add multi-domain operations as the icing on top of that cake. So it was really fascinating to look at how we're doing intel at that level and how we build that relationship with the partners and the allies at all different kinds of levels, from the tactical level to the mission command post level.
What was your experience like being a National Guard officer working in an active component environment for 3 years, particularly when you were chosen to be the ACE chief? And how did your interactions go, not only with your peers, colleagues, but your junior soldiers and then your commanders?
I have to say, and you and I have been National Guardsmen in active duty Army environments a lot. It was never a problem. Like, everyone was treated equally and fair, and like, just by virtue of that interview, it was always objective. I think that the headquarters was so appreciative of all of the people that volunteered to leave their regular lives to come there, because you think you're going to Europe, and some people are like, "Oh, I'm going to travel a lot," but like, they were, especially for intel planners in the ACE, like, there was not a lot of free time. We worked a lot of weekends, and so they were so just grateful to have competent people, and they're really willing to work with, like, they would hire captains into majors roles and be like, "Okay, you have less experience than we were looking for," but that coaching also was usually there if the person demonstrated like a strong work ethic. And so I've never been in an environment where National Guardsmen and reservists were treated as well. I would say, it was phenomenal to be, and I think in ways the headquarters is kind of proud of that, of like, hey, if we can build a blended team with reservists and National Guards and active duty and be competent, then imagine what we can do with all these foreign partners and other, just other entities that look at combat differently or have different, planning processes. So I think it speaks to kind of the adaptability of that headquarters to be able to, it takes a special kind of personality to integrate with anybody, right? Like, So it was a great place to be at the time that, and I was there at a great time to be an intel professional, I would say.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point about the overarching theme of the military, the Department of Defense as a whole here in the US, and that is, there's a difference between, as I had mentioned earlier, there's definitely a difference between the active component and the National Guard, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. You could see that play out in Desert Storm in early 1990. And although there were National Guard units that were there and they served well, you could tell that there was a training difference and there was a real separation between the National Guard and the active duty. And there was a real hesitancy on the active duty side to work with the National Guard. But after 9/11, and there was a forced integration in the sense because we needed so many more people to operate in both theaters between Afghanistan and Iraq, that one, the services came together, or the components rather came together, active duty and National Guard in particular, but it also makes for a stronger military because you now have people like yourself who have spent 3 years working in what would traditionally be considered an active duty position, an active duty post, and then coming back into the Guard and integrating all of those lessons learned, that now in the event, hopefully it never needs to happen, but in the event where the National Guard is again called up to serve alongside our active duty brethren, that we're just more integrated fully at this point. So it's certainly a win-win all around. Now, you also said that you were working a lot of hours, and as an intel planner, it was a challenging assignment. So, what would your day-to-day job look like? Right? When did your day start? When did it end? And what were you kind of doing throughout the day?
You mean intel planner or ace chief?
You know what? Either one. Yeah, either one.
As an intel planner, I would come in around, either role. I would come in between probably 6:30. Sometimes as an ace chief, I would come in earlier. I just need, and John, you've been an ace chief. It's like before the battle rhythm events kick off for the day, you need that quiet time to just kind of read the reporting. As an intel planner, we were working a lot with Fifth Corps to kind of deploy them and their intel soldiers forward. And so sometimes things would be in different time zones. Some of the Department of Army or ForceCom meetings we needed to attend were in different time zones, so we would either stay late. And then in that headquarters, and everyone who worked there has told you a lot, there's a lot of meetings. Like if you, and because the headquarters is doing so much stuff from modernization, to current planning, to campaign planning and future operations. So, you could pick an an operational planning team meeting every day that you probably would want to go to and be like, oh, that's interesting. But you really have to kind of pick and choose, okay, where do I integrate my cell the best? How am I helping, intel get integrated into operations? And the same thing as ace chief, there's only the ace chief, we had a lot more people that could go out and take those assessments to the different planning efforts. And so it was really great being a planner first, understanding the headquarters kind of rhythm and where the influence points were, and then being the ace chief and understanding, okay, where we need to integrate with the staff, and become more of a customer service entity to the staff, not just for the commander, right? I think you've kind of dealt with all of those things as a chief or as a J2 in some capacity. Sure. But we're taking those assessments out, or we're meeting with units. We did a huge planning effort to bring it, if you look at what you sort of brought into theater around March, April 2022, after Russia's attack started, it's kind of the biggest deployment that's been done in a while. We're talking about 2 Corps headquarters. We brought 5th Corps forward, 18th Airborne Corps was there, and so it was parts of those Corps headquarters. We have rotationally aligned units that go to Europe every year, but we added to that. So, it stretched the staff, but it also allowed us to really work on our systems and processes, especially for bringing in intel soldiers. Like, as we've gone to CENTCOM, sometimes it's kind of, it's like, okay, what do we need to bring? What do we need to do? We're trying to figure that out. So we were able to kind of make that more of a customer service process. It was an orders process too, but it was also a customer service process. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. So one of the other things I think is interesting is, working alongside NATO partners. I mean, we know, you read about it in the news all the time. What's NATO doing? Are they going to get involved in Ukraine and Russia? And really, NATO is such a key element to the United States' ability to project force and to help work alongside our allies in Europe to help defend them, and also looking at the interests of the United States abroad. So we know we work very closely with NATO. So what was What was that experience like? Did you have a lot of experience with NATO? Did you work alongside our partners? Were you just an American-focused mission particularly, or what was that like?
So interesting enough, while I was there, our USARAF commander also became dual-hatted as the commander for NATO land forces as well. So that really forced or encouraged our headquarters to work together a lot more closely. I didn't know anything about NATO, really very little when I arrived into Europe. And so it was great as we looked at, a couple different problem sets through these command post exercises. It was great meeting other corps, the multinational corps, and building those interpersonal relationships. They sent planning groups to us for Defender. It was Defender 2022, which we called M3. We ended up just doing a rock drill and not the full exercise. But to be able to meet those people, look at how they looked at the battle space, and just get to know the personal relationships we built, and also through our Americans in the LANCOM headquarters. I mean, that was instrumental to the success of everything that NATO's done together. And I just want to emphasize that the last that I understood, and I haven't looked at the news in a while, the response to Russia in Ukraine is not really classified as a NATO mission. It's multilateral partners coming together as they choose, and those multilateral partners happen to be in NATO. But NATO did work on increasing the size of the enhanced force presence units. So you can look those up there on the border areas. There's a couple in the Baltics. There's one in Romania. And so that effort came together very quickly because America participates in those units. And that was kind of NATO's effort to assure all the NATO partners along that, what Russia would consider its eastern flank, that, we're providing security and everything's okay. And then, those individual partners and other countries are contributing to Ukraine as they deem appropriate. There's a great website where you can see what munitions and equipment have been provided to Ukraine. And so there's countries on there like Cambodia, Pakistan, and Azerbaijan, which I feel like has kind of some problems of its own. But,
Sure.
so it's just been a great opportunity to learn about the alliance and understand how important it is for the future of NATO, of European security. And it is the best hope for the future of European security, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right there, and I would venture to guess that if you asked anybody in the defense industry throughout Europe, that they would agree. I mean, the European countries are just too small to defend themselves against a greater threat, and they need to do it in a unified manner. And NATO is the answer to that, no doubt. When you were working with NATO, we use this term NATO, but it's comprised of I believe now 34 if we include Sweden. But how many of those NATO countries do you say that you worked with or were around or whatever more closely? Would you say it's the bigger countries per se, right? Is it Germany, France, and those and others like that, or was it
I
everybody?
worked with Latvian officers, German officers, Greek officers, a couple of Spanish officers, Brits, yes, UK, our UK partners. I did work with a French officer. So it's all, we have, the headquarters also has NATO LNOs, so they have reps from several different countries because we had an Estonian representative and a couple of other countries that I forgot. But yeah, it's very diverse. All of the militaries have different size militaries, so countries contribute what they can. So some countries with larger militaries can contribute more presence than others, but that doesn't mean that the country is any less dedicated to the alliance. And also, I think what we take for granted is that how large the U.S. Army is. Like most of these countries have like maybe a handful of brigades. England has a couple of divisions. We have like 29 infantry, no, 12. It's 12 infantry divisions,
Yeah.
and that's like significantly more combat power than any of those other countries. I didn't know that, right? I had no idea about NATO, and so what's nice is some of those countries now, especially the Baltic countries in Poland, are looking to expand their militaries and growing them, just because and we kind of talked about this before. They feel the threat of Russia, stepping over that line a lot more intensely than other countries, right? Because it's right on their back door, the Baltics, Poland, and Romania. And so they're taking those opportunities to grow that military and grow their proficiency and grow their interoperability with NATO. So it'll be very interesting to see how the alliance continues to be cohesed, as we go into the next year.
Would you say that because you bring up such a great point? Would you say that you could get a real sense? Could you get a real feeling when working with your NATO partners that they they understood the Russian threat in a way that we just can't wrap our heads around because we're surrounded by two oceans, and that their involvement with American combat leaders like yourself was, I don't want to, I don't want to sound hyperbolic and say life or death, but really just so much more real and in your face than what we know.
Oh, absolutely. So people who are our age, their grandparents fought in World War II, or, for like the Baltics, they were in the Soviet Union and parts of Poland too, right? So, and some of the military leadership of those countries lived in the Soviet Union, right? So for them, it's a very real threat. It's not something that they experienced. Like, yeah, I mean, it's totally different for us in that respect, that the geographic closeness, the history, and kind of the familial ties to that. Absolutely. And just understanding the terrain, kind of an intuitive sense of how Russia would fight, because a lot of those militaries, when they were part of the Soviet Union, guess what? Some of the senior people were trained by the Russians, right? And their armies were structured based on the Soviet structure. They learned tactics from the Soviet military leadership, right? So, but I will say that also there's that demonstrated adaptability to say, okay, we'll talk about this later when we get into like artillery centric forces. A lot of those countries have really adapted to the combined arms maneuver philosophy of training. And that's because, we've learned a lot from them through our exercises and those not just becoming interoperable together, but learning from that intuitive perspective of what Russia would or wouldn't do, or how Russia would do something. And also in understanding the terrain. Like right now, our warfighters and CPX is kind of focused on Suwalki Gap, the Baltics, right? And so they understand that terrain way better than I will ever understand that terrain. And in those areas, just terrain is huge. I mean, it is a real driving force in any kind of battle that would happen there, right? So absolutely.
Did you also get a sense in, I don't want to, maybe your off time, in talking to some of these NATO partners, not so much about the threat of Russia today, but what the difference is in living in a country that you would consider democratic as compared to what they would have been considered 50 years ago in the Soviet Union, right? So the Baltics being a good example. Did you learn some interesting history about those differences from a personal experience?
Unfortunately, and I meant to get to the Baltics, and I just never was able to get there for personal travel. But I mean, I think that the Baltics, in working with, Baltic officers and Polish officers, I mean, they definitely don't want to go back to that, right? Like they appreciate how things are now. And, and a lot of those countries, like Poland, didn't want to be Russian to begin with, right? Like they've always been their own entity, and unfortunately they've been kind of stuck between, Germany and Russia during World War II and before that as well. And so I think these countries are just happy that they have their own defined identity. And you kind of see that in some of I think when Russia invaded Ukraine earlier in 2014, there was a lot of anti-Russia protests in some of the Estonian capitals, right? So I think that mentality, like from what I perceived, and also I probably didn't talk to a lot of those people that are, of pro-Russian background.
Would you say you got a sense too that because I'm certainly getting a sense that you appreciated your time working with your NATO partners and learning from them and understanding the differences in their military and the like. Did you get the sense that it was reciprocal, that NATO, um, at least in the people that you were dealing with, were appreciative of the United States and interested to learn from us and happy that we're there to help?
I think that when we go to do command post exercise, it really is an us and them mentality. It's just we're all part of NATO, and and people bring the knowledge and the understanding from all those perspectives. So it really wasn't. I guess it wasn't like that, if that makes sense. It was just like, okay, how do we figure out this problem? And we take a look at it and go, okay, well, this is what I have to bring. This is what I can bring. This is what I can bring to it. And looking at it from that perspective. I mean, maybe that's a positive thing, that it wasn't like
No, I agree, and I think what you've just demonstrated and what you just showcased in my ignorance was an American centric question, if you will, where I'm so quick to think that the United States being the greatest military force, and we hear about how the U.S. is NATO, right? Because we provide so much, that I had just made the assumption that working with the NATO partners, that they would turn to us and go, "Oh my God, it's so great you're here. We give you the money, and blah blah blah." But the fact that they were like, "This is just a team effort, and we're all here as members of this same team with the same unified mission," just kind of is a great way to remind everybody that the U.S. isn't as, we're not the end all and be all, and this is really a team effort. So,
Well, and John, a lot of that camaraderie and relationship was built through doing MD&P together, and nothing brings staffs together better than joint suffering in that environment.
Yes, it also creates a lot of contention and relationships damaged, and if you've been in a contentious, like you said, MD&P process, especially, say, I don't know, before NTC maybe, but
I think one of your previous guests, Lieutenant Colonel Temecin, and I actually had an argument at an MD&P session once. So
yeah, I'm not surprised that the two of you had an argument. But we'll just yeah.
He's very smart and talented.
Yeah, Colonel Temecin's great. You both are. Okay, so it seems, it's likely most obvious that when we're having this conversation about your time in Europe and working with our NATO partners, that the priority threat right now is obviously Russia, and with Russia officially and fully invading in 2022. What is it that you learned? And it doesn't have to be with your NATO partners at all, but what is it that you learned about Ukraine, and what is it that you learned about Russia as you had spent most of your time focusing on that problem set? What do we need to know about this war, literally, that's happening right now between these two countries?
I think at the tactical level, a lot of attention has been put on, drones and counter drone technology. And that's absolutely true. And there's a lot of great open source studies on those topics and electronic warfare. And now that we've kind of made this transition, or in the process of making the transition to multi-domain operations, I mean, those aspects are going to become critically important for us and everyone at the tactical level. Us, NATO, us, anybody in the Pacific or in Europe. But really kind of looking at the operational strategic level, what I really saw was like, kind of looking at the mindset and mentality that people apply to combat operations, like in a whole. And we talked about, I give a lot of credit to Tradoc, who started talking about, this artillery centric force and large scale combat operations back in 2014. But like just understanding how much Russia really is an artillery centric force. And they've, they tried to do combined arms maneuver at the beginning. Then it didn't work. So they went back to really what they've been successful at. And it makes a lot of sense based on, they, have always kind of prepared for the defense ever since Operation Barbarossa in World War II. They're like, we'll never be invaded again. And so their force structure was created after that kind of defensive operations. And so it's no surprise in Ukraine, they're doing better at defense operations than offensive operations. And also, offensive operations are a lot more dynamic. There's a lot more, especially if you're doing combined arms maneuver, there's a lot more decisions that need to be made. There's a lot more, complexity in what's moving and when's moving, and timing is very important. And so I attribute that to kind of learning the difference between, in Russian MD&P, for all intents and purposes, their process. I mean, their commander comes in and says, this is what we're doing. I need to know how much fuel, ammo, and people it will take to do this. And his staff goes and does the math. And there's a great RAND study on Russia's mentality about correlation of forces and means. There's a lot of really complicated math formulas that I don't understand. But the staff will come back and say, okay, it takes this much stuff, and we only have this much stuff, and then the commander will go back and ask for more stuff. And that's a very simplified, straightforward process. But, and our process is a little bit more longer and probably more contentious between the staff at some points. But, us generating those options for the commander and crafting it around, okay, we're going to give the commander flexibility by giving him good decisions, and we're going to kind of anticipate in time where those decisions will hopefully take place. I mean, that I think gives combined arms maneuver its lethality a lot of the times. And so just looking at that playing, like those mentalities playing out in the battle space, and as Ukraine kind of adopts more combined arms maneuver, they've been doing, they've been working to do that. And them getting successes at that really demonstrates why it's so important, and that's also like, we give the commander those decisions so he has options, so he can kind of change what he's doing. And, we get into branches and sequels, right? Okay, the whole thing didn't work. what can we do, where we don't have to start from the drawing board all over in a short amount of time. But Russia they just keep doing the same thing over and over. And even the meat wave attacks, like, a lot of open source outlets have talked about these meat wave. It's a horrible way to label it. The loss of human capitals is upsetting to me on both sides as a human being. But, it's kind of started out when they brought in all the convicts. They would just send them forward to the flat, kind of look where Ukraine was shooting from, and then kind of shoot back, right? Like using those guys to draw fire. But they kept doing it, and it didn't really gain them much terrain. You look at the terrain gains over the last, 12 to 18 months, it hasn't been that significant, but they keep doing the same thing over and over again. I don't know if that answers the question, if that answers your question.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Russia, from a military perspective, is doing just that? Why do they continue to just beat the same drum and not adapt?
This is just my opinion, right? I have no idea. Yeah. I mean, I know some things about Russians culturally, but their adherence to, like, I've been given an order is huge. And I think it stems from that authority of the commander saying, this is what we're doing. Us, we have this built into our training at every level. Like, if you get an immoral or unlawful order, you can say no, or you can offer the commander options, right? Like that, we're all structured around that. And just, I mean, if you're say you're, a division commander in America and your staff's not giving you options, I mean, you have to get more involved as the commander and more directive and authoritative, right? Whereas if the staff is giving you good options, then you can focus on reflecting on your experience and your intuition and say, okay, I think this is the best decision. Also based on the staff math that my officers have done, or my staff officers and NCOs and warrants have done, to say, okay, this is the best decision. But the Russians just don't have that flexibility built into their process. And at the higher levels, I mean, this is just my intuition and how I would feel. I wouldn't want to go and tell Putin that we didn't do the thing he told us to do, right? Like, that sounds like a really bad plan. I mean, so I think that kind of authoritative mentality from the top down really, really impacts their ability to come up with different. And it's strange because they're very adaptive kind of at the tactical level. The way both sides have adapted, with the drone, counter drone fight has been huge. But at those higher operational strategic levels, Russia just doesn't have that flexibility.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I doing some reading on the initial invasion. And when I say initial, I mean the one in 2022, initial full invasion. There are a lot of analysts that have opined that the reason that Putin decided to invade and then realized when they got to Kyiv they had to pull back was not because Putin didn't understand. It was because the staff and his most senior leaders were afraid to present the realities of what was happening within the Russian military. I mean, it's not a secret to know that the Russian government societal structure has a framework of corruption built around. And if you're part of this process, why would you look to the boss and go, listen, I know you really want to get to Kyiv within 72 hours, but 20% of our armor is gone because we were selling the plates off the back of a truck, right? Like, who's telling Putin that? Because of the fear factor you have when you're dealing with an autocracy. And so that makes sense when you're talking about a culture as a whole. And if you have the most senior levels involved in a culture where they can't tell the boss no, then that filters down through the ranks, and then you have majors who don't want to tell colonels and colonels who don't want to tell generals. So I think it makes sense. I mean, you say that it's based on your intuition, but working in that environment for 3 years and doing all the reading that you're doing, clearly that's an educated assessment for sure. Now, you also mentioned drones, which is something that's really popular and everyone's talking about, as they're watching the fight in Ukraine. How have drones affected what's happening on the battle space? And then more broadly, have you seen changes in the modern type warfare that we're seeing today? Or are we really just seeing what everyone used to do 50, 60, 70 years ago in World War II? We're just seeing it with a couple of new technological innovations. Is it really more different, or is it kind of just the same?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think that, when you look back kind of when we've seen drones used in this manner, kind of ISIS 2016, I don't think any of the evolutions or what people are doing is surprising to anyone. We kind of started to see that coming and see how profitable it is for entities to use, commercial off the shelf, UAVs versus, large manufactured ones, and how effective it is depending on what your operational or, tactical goal is. But we talked a lot about, the differences between World War II and now, of course. It's like it's the only thing we have to compare it to, right? And, one thing we found for commanders is that, at least on the Western side, right, we have all these sensors that we didn't have during World War II. And so now it just creates that information environment for a commander where he's getting more information instead of like, it almost seems easier when I read back on World War II history now, I'm like, that process seemed a little bit easier for commanders back then because they didn't have all of these data inputs. And it means that as staffs, we have to work a lot harder on making sure the data is processed properly and organized properly, but that we're analyzing it in a way that we get to the so what commander a lot faster. And it would be easy to get lost. And I think we've all kind of experienced that, easy to get lost in the data. If you've been to a division or a brigade warfighter in the last 5 years, you kind of get that at the first couple of days where the database manager's trying to figure it out and everyone's trying to get their process set. So, I mean, I know I didn't answer your question, but those challenges on how as staff officers, and how we organize information, they're only going to become more important as we move forward in combat.
So spending 3 years there and clearly almost every day of your 3 years, looking at a computer screen and assessing what's happening on a battle space, and how the Russians are fighting, how the Ukrainians are fighting, and how valuable, from your perspective, is that experience? Meaning, the last conventional fight the United States was involved in at any level, I guess you would say Desert Storm, and then possibly you could even say the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It doesn't really compare, but we did do some full spectrum operations and trying to get to Baghdad. But that's clearly a very different fight than what the Ukrainians and the Russians are going through. So how can you explain from your personal experience how much value you think the United States military is getting out of what's happening on the battle space and learning from that in real time?
I think it's been huge. I know Call has published a lot of things, and they've actually been forward to sit and talk with us as well. And then also, the Marine Corps has done a really good job of starting to modernize kind of their their electronic warfare structure, their training platforms. They talk a lot about it in their modernization 2030 plan that's on open source. But so from an understanding level, like reading and understanding like what Russia's doing and how it's doing it, and then also from that technological aspect of like starting to modernize, equipment. I think we're doing a good job. I think that the mentality, like that transition from coin to LISCO is going to be harder or easier depending on who you're talking to. I think TRADOC, again, I'll give them a lot of credit for starting to have this conversation with brigades and divisions, 6 years ago, 2014, that's more than 6 years ago, 8 years ago. I know, you and I are at a warfighter, and I walked in the first night shift, and there was like 18 down aircraft, and I was like, oh my, this is very different than coin. And so hopefully some of those transitions will go a lot faster because, we've been slowly mentally making that transition. But also it's understanding that whether you're talking about the Pacific or Europe or wherever we're asked to do large scale combat operations in the future, it is that visualization of not data, but analysis, and that very rapid, very easy understanding of that analysis by the commander, like that speed of decision making. That's what's gonna enhance our ability to win in the future, is understanding how those decisions are made and how quickly we can do that. And that's going to be a challenge for, a lot of different, I would say, military specialties, especially intel, because we will get a lot of information, and how do we create that, process that into analysis. But I think from all those, from prospect aspects of how we do that part, we've grown a lot in that understanding. And I think when you see the new Army integrated data platform, you will see how we've kind of integrated our lessons learned into developing what that tool will do for intel and analysts. So across the board, I think that everyone's paying attention and adapting in small ways and big ways.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges of working in our industry is that, there's nothing better than real world experience. And, you could talk about climbing a mountain, but what is it really like until you do it? And the unfortunate part is military is the same way. And you don't really know what it's like until you get into combat, but you have to have combat in order to do that. And who wants combat? No, nobody does. And it's one of those dichotomies or even ironies built in to working within our profession. So it's almost like, I hate to say it, but it's like an interesting or a positive scenario for the United States where we're not directly involved, but we're involved enough where we can learn, and NATO as well. Unfortunately, right, it's the Ukrainians and the Russians who are losing their lives. It isn't, our members, our citizens. And again, that's not something that I'm necessarily proud of. I'm not saying that. But unless you have a scenario like this where it's actually happening and you're at least tangentially involved by working somewhere like at EUCOM, then you don't really, you can't adapt as well, I guess. And now, unfortunately for us, we're in the same. When I say us, I mean the American military. We're in the same position with a potential adversary in the future, and that is China. And China's not in any battle space right now. They're not conducting live artillery fire on the battlefield against anyone, but they are also watching. And unfortunately, they're getting the ability to learn from what's happening between Ukraine and Russia as well, and they need it more than anybody else. China, the last time China's been in any conventional fight has been a very, very long time. So we certainly, as a military, have a little bit more recent experience, but the world's watching, I guess is what I'm saying, and everybody's kind of learning from what's happening on the battle space between Russia and Ukraine. And unfortunately, it's the members of those countries who are dealing with it directly and losing their lives, unfortunately. But so let me move to another question really quick. That's popular, and that is, and it gets a little bit into the political realm, but I'm not going to ask you a political question. And that is, there's a lot of corruption in Russian society, as we mentioned earlier, but there also is corruption in Ukraine, and there's corruption everywhere, but it's all based on a scale. And arguably, the levels of corruption in Russia and Ukraine are much greater than you would make the assessment for maybe Europe or the United States. Are you seeing any of that in particular having an effect on what's happening with either one of those militaries? I mean, is it such a problem that you can see in what you're reading and seeing what's happening on the battle space that personal corruption is really hampering the ability of these militaries to conduct their operations?
And John, I think that you and I have like a different scale of corruption having worked in Afghanistan together.
Sure.
Maybe it warps our understanding. Like we expect a lot more corruption, I think, in more places than others, probably. But that area wasn't really my analytical focus area. And I don't feel really qualified to answer like what corruption in Ukraine is like. What I did learn kind of in open source media, as I was an Intel planner kind of at the time, a lot of this reporting was going on in the news. Zelensky had been a famous actor and comedian in Ukraine, and a lot of his following was Russian. And I think even in some of his comedian routines, he'd had some jokes that indicated that he was more pro-Russian, or he had some pro-Russian leniencies or tendencies probably. But he ran for president on an anti-corruption campaign. That was one of the things he ran on his platform, was to minimize or start to shrink, Russian influence and Russian corruption. And it's interesting because, he really had to kind of put his money where his mouth was. When he started sanctioning, his parliamentary members that had ties to Russia and were known to be, influenced by Russia, that's when we started to see some of the rhetoric start. I believe that was like in the fall of, I want to say 2020. And then in March 2021, we saw that first buildup of forces on the Ukraine border. Russia did some combined arms exercises out in that area. And then, they kind of brought the people back and then left the equipment there.
All right. Now, let me ask you a question that is just, purely based on your personal opinion. I'm not, we're not going to be interested in any answer that's directly related to what your knowledge may be overseas or anything. I'm just looking at it from a personal perspective. Based on the actions that you've seen the Russians take, the Russian military and the Russian political leadership, do you foresee Putin going any further than where he is? Do you see him really trying to maybe get back to Kyiv, like he did in the first 72 hours, but was pushed back? Or do you perceive maybe a potential ceasefire, or at some level, or at least a proposed ceasefire, right, from Putin? Or how do you see that? There's a lot of different talking heads out there that have different opinions. Well, what's yours?
And you've heard me say this before, like, I'm not a Putin expert. There are very few people on the planet who actually are, but, what a lot of academics will tell you, Mark Galeotti, George Friedman, some of the smart people out there, is that Putin's goal is to eventually have influence over as many post-Soviet spaces as he can gain. So, theoretically, let's say that he gets to, the flood kind of settles down now, and they reconstitute and rebuild for a couple of years, and then that push, eastward will continue. I think that, Moldova with Transnistria definitely feels that way. And the eventual goal would be to at least influence or have some control over, a lot of those post-Soviet spaces. But, for Ukraine specifically, it gives him control over the Black Sea region. And then the other thing is expanding that buffer zone with NATO. It gives him that standoff space where he doesn't feel like NATO is right up against, his eastern flank. And so he's hoping with, Ukraine regime change that obviously if they could gain that terrain peacefully without losing people, I think that would be the intent, but he's willing to fight for it as the Russians have demonstrated, right? And you'll see a lot of academics out there. A lot of the academic assessments are that, they're very polarized. They're like, okay, Russia's going to concede, which historically Russia has never done. And then on the other end of that polar spectrum, you have like Ukraine's going to concede, which they've said they're not going to. But I think in the middle of that spectrum is the frozen conflict areas, which Russia has demonstrated its preference for. So when you look at Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and Transnistria, there's areas that they can manipulate that kind of distracts the rest of Europe or attempts to distract the rest of Europe. And that status quo keeps people negotiating or, bartering ceasefires. And some of those events, some of those areas, the thing's been going on for like 30 years, right? So I think that if Putin had his way, he would gain more terrain, but he's willing to go to that kind of frozen conflict situation, to continue to maintain the foothold he has. So, I mean, at the end of the day, he still has more terrain than he had at the beginning of 2022. And that's kind of a win, right? If your goal is 15 years from now or 30 years from now, and your goal is a lot of terrain, any step you make forward is positive news, right? And I think also what we need to understand is that the capability that Russia has, I always hear people go, Russia's losing or Ukraine's losing, and it's not that simple. But when you look at the amount of soldiers Russia has mobilized, and you can argue how well trained those mobilized soldiers were kind of in the fall of 2022, they still allowed, them to plug kind of the arterial bleeding in the defensive line at Kherson and retrograde the rest of the army and then reconstitute those parts of the army. And then when you look at what they've mobilized out of, the rest of Russia, the equipment that they've brought forward, I mean, they have done something on such a scale that I think that we would be foolish to not give credence to that and understand that they're capable of doing that. And with a population of roughly about 6 million military aged males, I mean, he could do this for years, as long as his economy can keep pace with manufacturing equipment. But the equipment and the people, he's got a substantial amount of those he can draw on or he can manufacture. What we talk a lot about is the leadership capability that they've lost. That first initial invasion, had a lot of the leaders, enlisted and officer leaders that had trained in combined arms operations. And so a lot of those guys died. And so it's like, you can't manufacture that in a facility. Now the guys that are surviving now are learning those lessons, but I feel like that's kind of one of the harder things it's going to be to replace.
Yeah. And that's a great answer. And unfortunately, what from my foxhole, and which is obviously different than yours, clearly, much more limited, but I think there's relevance to the claim that the Russians just have more people and more stuff, and the Ukrainians don't have that. And there's just only so many people that you can produce, that Zelensky can produce to fight. And And I think it is true that Putin is in a position where, if this turns out to be, one side just waiting the other out, I think it's unfortunate that Russia has more of that. And I don't know what plans are clearly to try and mitigate that issue, and how long. I don't know, but if it turns it to be, just this, we're going to wait here and see how long we can go. I just think Russia's got the advantage there. I don't, unfortunately, for our Ukrainian friends. So, but again, who knows what's going to happen? Who knows if Putin's going to make a silly choice and go ahead and attack Poland or something of that nature, and now he's got a whole nother world on his hands if NATO triggers Article 5. So yeah, we'll see. Let me ask you one last question here as we wrap up. Let me ask you something a little bit more personal, and but within the professional realm. Given the time that you spent over there and the reading that you've done and watching the Ukrainians fight to defend themselves, what do you feel, or how do you feel about the potentiality of this potential to fight coming directly to your doorstep? And what I mean is, what happens if NATO triggers Article 5 because of some unforeseen circumstance, and the New York Army National Guard calls you as a battalion commander to take a battalion of soldiers overseas and engage in combat in support of Ukraine? Is that, how does that make you feel? Is that something that you feel that you're prepared for, and something that you know, you'd be interested in doing? Obviously, we both understand that when called, we fight, and we will. But more broadly, how does that make you feel?
And I can't stress this enough that this is my personal opinion. It's not affiliated with any DoD position. But I wholeheartedly support Ukraine's fight for national sovereignty and self-determination. As a woman in this country, in America right now, self-determination is kind of a big deal. And it's a theme that's in the media and stuff. And so I understand how it feels to have that kind of taken away from you a little bit. And, the Ukrainians have said pretty loud that they do not want to be Russian. At least most of the Ukrainians have said that. A lot of them have. And that is a fight worth fighting for, I think. And, me, I don't say this lightly. I've been a commander in Afghanistan before, responsible for soldiers' lives. And I support the Ukrainians.
Yeah, as do I. And it's but it's interesting to think about where, a lot of people, I drive down the road here and I see here where I live or wherever I go, and there's Ukrainian flags around, and there's bumper stickers, and we all support Ukraine. And why wouldn't we want to support a country that's defending itself against an invasion? Of course. But it's one thing to say that you ideologically support a country or a movement, but it's another thing to say, okay, well, I'm also going to take 275 of my friends and I'm going to put them in harm's way in support of Ukraine. And again, when called, we're gonna do what we got to do. Um, but
And one thing I forgot to say about that is I can't emphasize this enough either. Nobody wants Article 5. Russia doesn't want Article 5, and neither does NATO. I think that is a scenario that plays out poorly for both sides. And so I just wanted to emphasize that in that conversation thread.
Yeah, I could agree or would agree, even on a bigger picture. I don't have to spend 3 years in Europe to say that I am highly confident that that President Putin and his Russian military wants nothing to do with a war with NATO. They just don't. And I think that actually is a broader point that can be addressed about all of the global conflict that's going on right now. It doesn't matter what, and again, this is just my opinion, my perspective, but it doesn't matter what is said from a political podium. The reality of the scenario is Russia doesn't want to fight NATO. Right? They can't get through a Ukrainian military supported just tangentially by countries that happen to be involved in NATO, and he's struggling to get that done. He doesn't want a fight with NATO. Iran, no matter what the Ayatollah says, does not want to fight with Israel. They do not want a conventional fight because they're going to struggle and they know it, especially an Israel that's supported by the United States. What scares me a little bit is that I think that right now, and I know that your experience is Europe focused and Europe centric, but that China feels that way today. I don't think China wants anything to do with an American military adversary in real combat. and then even potentially NATO, and I have a whole opinion on how NATO could potentially get involved in the Indo-Pacific, even though that's not its defense area, but that's for a whole nother topic. But anyways, but potentially, I do think in the next few years, there's a time when the Chinese military leadership and President Xi says, I think I'm ready. And that's a really, really scary prospect because, the U.S., I think, has for a long time demonstrated such strength that, again, no matter what anybody says, they really don't want to go to war with the U.S. But I don't know if I'm getting that same feeling from China. I really don't. I think I'm getting this is, obviously on the open source side, I'm getting a perspective that they might want to challenge it. And they may want to, I don't know when it is, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever. And that could end up being really, really bad. And could be pretty devastating for the whole world, not only those that are the combatants in both of those militaries. But hopefully that's not the case. But do you have any opinion on that?
So when I look at Russia and China too, I kind of see them kind of preparing to go both ways. Like, if that makes sense, like with their involvement in both of their involvements in Africa, China through its BRICS program, its influence in other places, like, I think they're kind of preparing for, like, if I can do it without doing it, whatever it is. I don't, first of all, I don't know anything about China, not very much. Then they'll have the ability to do that economically, at least. And then, but I can't really speak to their military preparation or any of those things, but just their global influence on both sides, I find a little bit concerning.
Yeah, Joint Sword 2024 is what you're referring to, and it was it's concerning in the sense, and again, this is, I'm not an expert either, but I do spend some time, focusing on this stuff every day as a J2 for New York, and what I would say is that it's concerning from those that don't watch too closely, because you're talking about 60 naval vessels surrounding all of Taiwan. They had over 30 aircraft that were involved. And so, that looks like invasion preparation. And you know what? On some level, it is. It is. And from a logistics standpoint, it is from a communication standpoint. And China is continuing to practice a potential operation to get in and try and take back the island if they have to. And I agree with you completely that most of these leaders, if not all of these leaders, operate with the mindset that I don't want to have to do it by force, but if this mission is a priority, is a high enough priority, then I feel like I'll have to do it by force, which is, again, what I think, and I think you would agree, what Putin did in Ukraine in 2022. China would love to be able to take Taiwan back under its umbrella and do it with not firing one shot. But I think it's a big enough priority where they will fire a shot if they think that they need to. And, that's Joint Sword 2024 is not different in the sense that it's a different scale of exercise or a different type of exercise that China often involves itself in, but it does get just a little bit better. It gets a little bit more comprehensive. It gets a little bit more refined every time that they do it. And, practice makes perfect. On combat will never be perfect, but the more practice you have, the better it gets. And I fear for that day potentially, and hope it never happens. But okay, so listen, I think we're coming up on about our hour time frame here, and what I would like to do is, we've got so much here to talk about, that we'll certainly have you back in the future, ma'am. I thank you for taking the time today. But leave us with a couple of resources. I know that you, for those of us that are listening that want to absorb as much of this as possible and want to get as want to become well read. What do you suggest for our listeners? Take a look at, listen, read, to help them get to that point.
I would look at The Next 100 Years by George Friedman. He's got a whole chapter on what he calls the Russia 2020 rematch that kind of explains the history and Putin's intent. Russia's Border Wars and Frozen Conflicts by James Coyle. Excellent book that kind of gives you the patterns of kind of these big four frozen conflicts that are out there. And then there's a couple of unclassified documents that I think I sent you. Precision Strike Documents talks about Russia and nuclear escalation. And then there's a fascinating article, The Russian Military Decision-Making Process and Automated Command and Control. That's by McDermott and Bartels. Great document. And also Mark Galeotti, I mentioned him before. He does a kind of a weekly podcast, and he talks about anything from tactical stuff to Russia strategic thinking. Very, very excellent and free. And then just thanks so much for having me. It was great to sit down and chat. And it's been great to see your effort here, your enterprise kind of take off. So it was really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, I appreciate it, man. Thanks for taking the time. I'm going to put those links down in the show notes, and I'll also put a bunch of acronyms down there as well, because we went a little military specific, and we can't live without acronyms in the military. So I'll ensure that I put some explainers down there, and for those that happen to not be in the military but really want to fully understand exactly everything that we were talking about. So thanks again, ma'am. I really appreciate it, and you'll definitely be receiving another invitation from me in the future as we have more discussions on Russia. This is not going away anytime soon, and thanks again, ma'am. So what you just heard was a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Bennett of the New York Army National Guard about her time in Europe, specifically over the last 3 years, and what she was doing to support our NATO partners and the Ukrainian military as it defends itself against the invasion from Russia. As always, thanks for joining me this week. You can reach out to me at any time, John Moloch at headlinesinhistory.com. You can catch me on social, on YouTube, Headlines in History, or Instagram, Headlines in History. As I had mentioned last episode, we're going to continue our interview sessions with the lieutenant colonels, a handful of lieutenant colonels in the New York Army National Guard, and we have 2 more coming up. So stick around in the next couple weeks for those interviews. And don't forget, for all of your outdoor knife needs and other utensils, be sure to check out spanglerforge.com, SPANGLERFORGE.com. Another member of the New York Army National Guard doing great work with a great company there. And be sure to check out all his outdoor knife and blacksmith stuff that he has going there. It's really some incredible stuff. So thanks again for joining us this week, and I look forward to talking to everybody next week.